this. We also know that ESG investing is growing strongly. Historically, it has been led, it started in the US actually, it's been led in the last decade probably in Europe. But what's happening right now, quite strikingly for people active in Asia, is the development of this sustainable finance or ESG investing industry also in Asia, in a number of jurisdictions. We know that Asia is not one unique area, but a number of jurisdictions. And we know that in many places, this is starting to happen, and this is happening very fast. This is what we will discuss today with an expert panel on this topic, and we'll go into the details of what's happening in Asia and what can be done. But before that, in order to set the scene, I would like to invite Mr. Douglas Flint to make a presentation of these challenges and what is at stake. Mr. Douglas Flint is the chairman of Standard Life Aberdeen, and I will leave him the floor right now. Thank you.
Tongi, thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a privilege to have been invited to offer some opening remarks to this panel discussion, whose title encapsulates the key issues facing infrastructure investment in Asia, how to catalyze ESG investing in order to build a sustainable program of development. But I think it's worth starting with a broader perspective to highlight the criticality of the subject. From a global perspective, the world's economies and the global financial and investment communities that support those economies are, in my view, facing three existential threats that cannot be resolved without coordinated actions and unprecedented levels of investment. These are required to deal with climate change, the social inequalities which, if unaddressed, lead to social unrest and failed states, and finally, unsustainable production and consumption, which is exacerbated by population growth, that growth concentrated in many of the least developed countries of the world. And without investment in the infrastructure to build the sustainable economic and social ecosystems required to address these issues, the world faces future migration patterns that it is completely unprepared to deal with, either financially or socially. For Asia, this is particularly critical. As we know, the region contains some of the most pressing developmental issues in the world. A significant number of people still living at subsistence level, insufficient or inefficient energy, transportation, water supply, sanitation, and logistics infrastructures to meet the accelerating growth of urbanization and population growth. And according to the World Health Organization, 70% of the most polluted cities in the world are in Asia. It's estimated that developing Asia has some $20 to $30 trillion worth of infrastructure investment spend needed over the next 15 years. The region, therefore, has to attract significant private capital on top of government and multilateral development bank capital to fund its development. And this investment has to be made sustainably, otherwise we repeat the mistakes of the past. Now, the good news is that there's considerable momentum towards getting this right. First, issues of sustainability are now recognized to be of global importance. Influential asset owners are demanding change and are actively allocating capital to managers who incorporate environmental, social, and governance standards into their investment processes. Regulatory pressures are building for greater transparency and are attacking pollution. And this changing landscape is reflected in the number of Asia-based signatories to the UN's Principles for Responsible Investment, which have grown by 26% between 2016 and 2018. Second, there's growing evidence that ESG integration does not hurt investment performance. What used to be seen as a trade-off between generating attractive returns and reducing risk and doing the right thing is now increasingly aligned. We can see that performance of selected sustainability indices is largely now in a par with benchmark indices over different time horizons. Third, as asset managers are increasingly and properly called on to demonstrate their social contribution and impact, they can, by actively advancing a holistic cross-asset class appraisal of ESG factors through engagement, insight, and influence, not only generate better long-term outcomes for their clients, the environment, and wider societal stakeholders, but also will be able to promote better capital allocation. ESG is a journey, not a destination, and engagement is the mode of transport. At Aberdeen Standard Investments, which is our investment arm, ESG analysis and proactive substantive engagement are integral to our investment processes. But to get to where we need to, needs public-private partnership at scale, and leadership that is ambitious. Now, the AIIB has taken this lead with its ambition to develop infrastructure as an asset class, to develop debt capital markets for infrastructure, and by promoting the integration of ESG principles into fixed income investment in emerging Asia. I believe that infrastructure as an asset class is an urgent need, both for the financing and the savings markets, and the more attention that can be directed to defining the standards and features of this asset class will enable it to build out better and faster. By building a portfolio of bond investments based on its ESG investment principles, this will enable the sustainable debt capital markets in Asia to develop, will support the development of the infrastructure asset class, and what the AIIB is leading should have, and is intended to have, a catalytic influence on capacity building by mobilizing additional private capital from institutional investors. At Aberdeen Standard, we were honoured to be entrusted by AIIB to be their partner in this important initiative, and will be running our involvement out of our Singapore office, illustrating that the necessary expertise does exist within the region. We share AIIB's commitment to deepening the region's capital markets and building a sustainable ESG ecosystem. The significant need for more infrastructure investment in Asia offers a real opportunity to embed ESG principles, while countries and communities accrue the long-term social and economic value that the asset class will contribute. And this momentum and focus is precisely the reason why Asia represents a prime opportunity for responsible investors to allocate private capital to large-scale, sustainability-linked projects. And more broadly, there is growing recognition that failure to address the three core risks that I talked about will create significant long-term portfolio risks, not just in companies with high exposure to climate change or carbon intensity. Many businesses will be challenged by competition for natural resources, concerns over deforestation, recycling issues, management of energy use, and waste management solutions and concerns, to name but a few. So we believe as a consequence that ESG investment principles are going to be applied more broadly, rapidly by investors worldwide. Technological advances and increasing transparency will not be reversed. We're reminded with increasing frequency of the costs and ramifications that climate change is creating. And lastly, as individual investors increasingly gain access to tools to play a more active role in their investments, they are in the position to express their preferences without necessarily, or indeed at all, having to sacrifice return to achieve them. So the relatively low engagement in Asia historically on ESG is both a challenge and an opportunity. The ability to have meaningful impact globally through ESG investment is larger through Asia than through the developed markets. And beyond managers incorporating ESG analysis in their investment process, it's also clear to us that the demographics and the growing democratization of savings will also play its role in further driving assets towards ESG strategies. Younger generations are entering the investment savings markets with different priorities from older generations, and those changing preferences combined with technology increasingly placing greater control in the hands of the end investor will further impact asset allocation favorably. We would highlight three critical areas where societal pressure will accelerate ESG momentum. First, as climate change becomes an economic rather than just a moral reality, sustainability-linked infrastructure will transform how governments build and finance climate-resilient energy infrastructure, energy efficiency, sustainable transport, and waste management. Second, the imperative to restore and protect clean air, because East Asia has the highest mortality rate from air pollution, will be important. Industries involved in the development and manufacturing of clean air-related products will greatly benefit and turn the grey skies issue into a green opportunity. And third, the ASEAN region is the largest producer of palm oil and natural rubber, both of which are essential raw materials for everyday lives. The sector, however, is challenged by sustainability risk, increasingly of concern to global citizens, including deforestation, loss of biodiversity, land grabbing and forced labour, and players in this sector are being forced to change their business models in order to ensure long-term survival. As Asian asset owners co-finance the region's development, they can also lead to growth of sustainable investment through making ESG a prerequisite for all investment decisions, promoting adoption of the recommendations of the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, and targeting new investment through ESG-compliant mandates, expanding their issuance of green bonds. All of these things are happening at pace today. So finally, I'm going to close just by recognising again AIIB's leading role in leading on a sustainable infrastructure investment. By incorporating ESG principles into their Asian credit portfolio, AIIB is leading and demonstrating proof of concept, exhibiting leadership and capacity building, and increasing interest in responsible investing, so contributing to building a market ecosystem to the benefit of investors, issuers, the people of Asia, and indeed the rest of the world. Let me now stop, hand over to Tanguy to take things forward, and thank you for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Flint. I don't know if you've realized how seriously and silently everybody listened to you, because probably the effect of being into a music room, this is not that usual that we have a debate in a music room like this one.
Certainly not going to sing.
So I'm talking like I manage the sustainable banking team at Crédit Agricole CIB. I'm very proud and honored to be here today to moderate this roundtable and the debate that we'll have together afterwards. So I'm lucky to have here a roster of experts, everyone in his field, from investors to issuer and to market specialists. So certainly the right setup to discuss about ESG investing in Asia. So we have Hans Ulrich Beck, who's Executive Vice President of Research at Sustainalytics, admittedly the leading ESG rating agency, and especially very active in Asia. So I think you'll be rightly positioned to discuss this with us. We have Mr. Jonas van Oldenskjöld, maybe the name that is as difficult as pronounced as mine, from Swiss Re, so also a leading reinsurance company. So and you're on the asset management side, so head of asset management in Asia, and clearly as a reinsurance company able to discuss about the pricing of climate change and how it impacts also your liability side. We have also from the AIIB, Mrs. Courtney Lawrence. Thank you for being there. So you're a senior environmental specialist at the AIIB. And so clearly you'll be able to explain what the AIIB is doing in this field, which is quite innovative in Asia. Mr. Beck, no, sorry, Mr. Schaaf, sorry. Mr. Schaaf from the Luxembourg Stock Exchange. So the Luxembourg Stock Exchange is the leading marketplace for environmental finance globally by far. And so we're happy to be here in your hometown, certainly, and also to hear your views about this. And of course, as we always say, last but not least, Stanislas Potier from Amundi. Amundi is probably the leading asset manager globally when it comes to ESG investing. And I will start with you, Stanislas, asking you, of course, you can complete the presentation that I've just started, but also tell us, I mean, Amundi has taken a strong commitment in terms of integrating ESG throughout all your portfolios, and also in Asia, where you have a very strong footprint. How does it work practically? And practically, what does it mean when it comes to investing in emerging market in Asia?
Thank you, Tanguy, and good afternoon to everyone. Well, it's true that in last October 2018, Amundi took a bold commitment saying that, of course, we would continue to be very innovative on responsible investment solutions, and we, of course, will come back on it, but we would also integrate ESG fully, and would become a 100% ESG house by 2021. So what it means very quickly, it means, of course, that we're making sure that we're changing a bit the way the business is done, And we're making sure that all our portfolio managers fully integrate ESG screening in every investment decision. So to do that, we are in the implementation phase, but again, we make sure that they do not only look at it, have access to ESG data, but they really consider it and take it into account when it comes to investment decisions. It's the same for analysis. So we have to create a full continuum between credit, equity, and ESG analysis and make sure that everything is shared, used by our PM, and at disposal to our clients. And I would say ESG integration, to go very quickly, is also very important on engagement with corporates and in our voting policy. So that means that, as you know, engagement has become really a key issue if we want to monitor progress, improve us, push best practices, know deeply all the sectors and materiality of criteria. And General Assembly meetings are a particular moment in yearly life of corporates. And we wanted not only to look at governance issues that spontaneously emerge in AGMs, but also to integrate ESG issues. And we started, as of this year, 2019, integrating in our voting policy climate and social inequalities. Social inequalities, at first, from the standpoint of the remuneration policy and salary inequalities. So that's to talk about ESG integration. And what I'm amazed at is that you all know, of course, that Europe has been a driver in ESG building, in the market, in SRI pushing and all that, and mostly institutional investors from Northern Europe, but not only. Of course, Northern American market is very also dynamic. But again, I'm puzzled at the dynamics in Asia, which is absolutely outstanding. And what we have to keep in mind, and I'm very pleased to have also Courtney with us today, is that Asian actors will not go step by step. I mean, they right away jump to the most mature and innovative solutions and demanding solutions to contribute to, again, ESG screening and solutions to accelerate climate mitigation and climate adaptation to start with, but also on social issues.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Stanislas. I'll come back to you certainly afterwards because I have some questions to ask you what you just said. But maybe we'll stay on the asset management side for this first question. Jonas, I'm turning to you. I mean, in your last annual report, if I'm not mistaken, you have stated a wish list of what is necessary to achieve ESG investing properly in Asia. Can you elaborate a bit on that? What's Swiss Re wish list?
Sure. Absolutely, I will try to do that. And I'm very glad you're asking this question now, 2019, because just a year ago, the topic of sustainability investment in Asia was insignificant. Whenever I sat in similar situation like this, people just turn around because it was all about return. But I would say over the last 12 to 18 months, there have been a massive change, and something you indicated as well, but you get more and more requests. And I think we have more and more of PRI signatories and so on. So we see this change coming on. And then you need to ask, so why is that happening now? And I think there are two drivers of that. One is technology. It basically makes it possible to go from nothing to a very quite advanced level. The level of transparency, the speed with how information is shared goes so much faster, which means that the ultimate beneficiaries or investors asking for more and more of this, and this, of course, driving people's behavior as well. The other thing I think is more around I call it a social norm. People start realizing that there is a climate change going on. So I normally use an example, 2022, when you hear that number, many of you thinking about the World Cup in Qatar, or for that sake, the Winter Olympics in Beijing. But 2022, that is also over the last 22 years, we have recorded the global warmest year have been over the last 20 of them. So 2022 is also that. And people realizing that, and people putting pressure and considering things like that in their behavior. They're also considering, as soon as they buy an electrical vehicle, where have the cobalt in the battery been mined? And how has it actually been mined? What is the consequence of that? And coming back to that technology thing, today you can find out that much quicker. So companies need to change in order to meet those changes in what I call social norms. But coming to your question, like what is my wish list? And I think it's very similar like others, and it's kind of bold to go out with a wish list things. But I think it's important that it happened in symbiose with many of the representatives here. Maybe we're missing the regulatory or policy-making side, but we listened to them before. Many of you did the same. So I think starting with ourselves as investors, what do we need to do? Yeah, we need to constantly challenge our existing investment process. We need to learn how do we absorb more and more information in the different steps of our process. We need to educate people, and we need to invest into this process. We also need to recognize, as I said before, to be challenged by our beneficiaries on how we do things. So we need to meet these demands quite heavily. If you look at the investee side, AIB or similar, the pressure to be transparent increasing. And it is not just about being transparent and disclose things, it's also to consider how much do we want to disclose and how much work do we need to do in order to attract this larger and larger growing pool of assets that's searching responsible investment. So effectively, it has an impact on your cost of capital if you're not doing it. Then we have maybe more the service providers that have a very important role into this, right? Because you translating and providing this information from the investee to us and the other way around. To continue doing that, bringing up sector-specific matrices, bringing up more detailed studies and deep dive information and benchmarking will be important as this grows. And then lastly, who is not here, maybe unfair then to challenge the policymakers, right? But they have the role of being the kind of decrease in the whole process here. They need to both push and pull along this road, right? There need to be consideration. What are the capital charges for someone that focusing on responsible investment versus someone that risking to end up with stranded assets? Can I adjust my capital model for that? They also, of course, need to be enforceful in certain situations. And one thing I think growing more and more, ESG, which, by the way, is not only the E. It's important to think about the S and the G very much. It's easy to end up with just thinking about climate change, right? But I think the ESG marketing gimmick has a little bit of a snowball effect for a moment. And there have been some lately report on that. There, of course, the regulator has an importance to do that, to actually make sure that all our others actually do what we're saying to do. So I think there's several different functions that policymakers need to do this across the line.
Thank you. I like your wording about what the regulators should do and the role of policymakers in this market. It's true that it would be interesting also increasingly to hear them in such forum. Courtney, you're at the AIB both an issuer and an investor, or a lender, an investor and a lender. So on both sides, you clearly have ESG policies that you can deploy, and you have actually started to deploy. Can you tell us what is the vision of AIB in this field?
Sure. Thank you for asking. I'm in I think the privileged position of being both in an organization that has both recently issued our inaugural bond and also this week launching or announcing our first capital markets project. So we are both an asset owner and an issuer. I'm struck by Asia, first of all, the rapid pace. It's incredible. I think part of that is because of the green bond market in China. But the way I view ESG is much more holistic than what green bonds offer. And as I mentioned, we issued our first bond recently, AIIB. We chose not to label. And that was really because our view is that in order to get to the sustainable future that we need, we have to take a holistic approach. We really need to look at the whole business model of the issuer. And it's really about the strategy to transition to both a socially sustainable and an environmentally sustainable world. So we are very excited. I came from New York, moved to Beijing, and I can tell you that when I look at the data, Asia is the fastest growing region. Part of that is because of Japan and the GPIF and the movements that they've made in the last 18 months. But I don't know if many know this, China has a 300% increase in sustainable investing year on year. So, I mean, that's incredible to me, and it really presents the opportunity that we have at AIIB to catalyze sustainable investment across the region. So how are we going to do that? We are launching the Sustainable Capital Markets Initiative, and we've announced our strategic partnership with Aberdeen Standard Investments. The Sustainable Capital Markets Initiative is really intended to catalyze ESG strategies across the region. And what we mean by that is we are going to use our own portfolio as a proof of concept. We want market participants to see the performance that we have, know what the strategy is, the ESG framework will be disclosed, and really take the leap with us to invest with a similar strategy. It's going to take some market building. I think about the local markets in Asia, India, Indonesia, Malaysia. There's a lot of really exciting, growing markets, and they're looking for, I think they're already increasing, as I mentioned with China, their sustainable investment.
Thank you very much, Courtney. So again, I think I have interesting things to ask you, but I will come back to you afterwards on this. So Robert, I didn't mention earlier, so you're the CEO actually of the Luxembourg Stock Exchange, and so clearly the leader in terms of sustainable finance and green bonds were mentioned before. Can you tell us a bit what is the role of a stock exchange in this market? How can you facilitate the growth of ESG? Why would you tell an issuer you should come to you for an ESG-related transaction? Why should they go to the stock exchange in Luxembourg?
Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity of explaining to a broader audience coming from different parts of the world what we are doing here. But let me first say, in fact, my day, in fact, was made by President Xi Jinping earlier this morning when he announced that, in fact, the next funding program will be listed on the Luxembourg Stock Exchange. So that was the good news this morning.
Was it a surprise?
You know, in fact, I like to hear it officially. Maybe a word, in fact, about how do we see a role of an exchange in the first place in capital markets. We see ourselves as a linking pin between issuers who raise capital and investors who invest in financial products. And typically, in fact, what exchanges provide is efficiency of trading platforms on one hand, and transparency, that means availability of data to the investor. And when I look translating this into our specific situation where we are an exchange a little bit unlike any other, because we are mostly a listing exchange, especially focused on debt instruments. And as you all know, debt instruments are less traded on exchanges and more OTC. But the role that we see, in fact, is we are servicing, first of all, issuers, whether they issue conventional instruments or, in fact, green bonds, just to take the example. But we are making, above all, we are creating the transparency of the documentation towards the investor. And that means, and I'll give you a number, we are listing currently 36,000 different instruments, most of them debt instruments, and probably makes us one of the biggest exchange around the globe. from a number of securities listed, and we are making all that information from the regional prospectus to whatever, in fact, documentation comes up, available to the investor and creating transparency. All of that is available on our website for free to anybody, retail as much as institutional. Now, when I'm turning to ESG or green bonds and social bonds and sustainability bonds, in fact, all these instruments, we are talking about conventional financial instruments, but where, in fact, there are additional elements to that, and the documentation related to these instruments is not mandatory. In fact, it's voluntary, in fact. That's how the market functions today. When we launched our green platform, and that's our answer to the Paris Agreement, we said, in fact, it's not good enough to just earmark a segment of green bonds or whatever instruments. We decided to create a separate exchange, in fact, a new platform entirely dedicated to what we call today, it's still called the Green Exchange, but it's sustainable financial instruments. And we are making all of this information available to the investor on one website. So you do not need to chase, in fact, the information everywhere. That transparency is, at the end, the key to the success of that platform. And yes, today, in fact, when we're looking at green, social, and sustainability bonds, we have a world market share of 50% of everything that's issued worldwide and listed on an exchange, because there are a number of things that are not listed. Now, the role of an exchange goes beyond that, because the point is today, when we are looking at second opinions, use of proceeds reports, impact reports, post-issuance, whatever you call it, it's a huge amount of data, which, as I said, we make available to the investor. But the question is how to digest all of that data. And that's the big challenge. It's not standardized. And the work, in fact, we are currently contributing is to work with AI, machine reading, to extract, in fact, the key elements of these various instruments so that investors get more easily access to the key points, and above all, that information needs to be made comparable. That's what is key. So from that point of view, we have a huge role to play as exchanges. I think every exchange is trying to develop its own model of how to contribute. But I would like to highlight just for a second, there is this UN-sponsored initiative of the Sustainable Stock Exchanges, which already exists for 10 years, and where a lot of good work on ESG, in fact, has been done in the past. We, for example, are looking currently on a broader basis on how can we help companies that do not only, in fact, issue green bonds, but in fact are active in capital markets overall, and where investors are more and more asking the question about what's your ESG profile at the end of the day, to help them, in fact, and guide them with a catalog, with guidances, in order to move progressively in the direction of issuing reports, because I firmly believe also that green bonds today evaluate projects, but in the future, in fact, there will be much more weight put on the profile of issuers themselves.
That's interesting. And you know that, of course, one of your competitors has actually bought an ESG rating agency recently, so maybe you would be able to elaborate a bit on that later on. And just to keep on this discussion with ESG rating agency, I will turn to Hans Ulrich. So you are part of Sustainalytics and in charge of the research specifically. And so clearly Sustainalytics and ESG rating agency are playing an increasing role in what has been discussed by almost all the 4 panelists before you, which is data gathering on what the issuer are doing. Can you tell us how you help actually this decision-making process on the ESG investing? And maybe also what are the specificities that you see in Asia on this aspect? Because clearly, as was underlined earlier, it's also a young market there.
Thank you, Tanguy. It's great to be here today. Maybe I can start with summarizing a bit what we really do. I think our company, Sustainalytics, might not be very familiar to this audience. And in simple terms, what we do is we collect a lot of environmental, social, and governance (ESG) information on corporations. We process this, we structure it, and then we sell this data, in fact, mainly to an investor community. So it's really an investor-paid business model. Our clients are asset owners, asset managers, increasingly also credit and loan departments of banks who find interest in this type of data. I note that there's a small but growing also corporate client base, and that's mainly around second-party opinions on green bonds that were mentioned here. I mean, how is this data used? I mean, just to also underline, we provide ratings on companies, and there's maybe sometimes the feeling, well, we are setting a standard of who's good or who's bad. I mean, I see us more as an information provider, and we provide data, ratings, we provide underlying assessments, metrics, and our clients use all of this. So really, we have many clients who get data feeds, and all our data is pulled into client systems and used in a way that we often don't even know. If you talk about, say, the investor community, the data is really used to support portfolio creation, security selection. It's integrated into valuation models. It's used for reporting purposes. Active ownership activities, engagement is also what we support. And so we see a role really to, let's say, others said they are oiling the machine. I think we are also oiling it, providing really data insights that ultimately support investors or corporates to implement their ESG or sustainability strategies. When it comes to Asia, we have, let's say 5 years ago, I don't think we had any office there. We set up offices recently with some presence in Australia, Tokyo, and Japan, and Singapore. And talking about that market, I mean, one thing to say is it's not one market. It's very big differences within Asia. But I would say it's way bigger than in Europe. I think there are also differences in Europe or North America, but the differences are quite big. It feels also like a market that's less connected, or at least when you think about what's happening in the ESG space, there is some, say, cross-pollination, but I think less so than maybe what's happened in other regions. While there are big differences, I think the one common theme is that often what's happening in these markets has a top-down driven component. So the degree to which governments and policymakers support ESG investing or sustainability investing, the role of regulators or the stewardship codes that have been introduced in some countries, clearly also the role of some of the reference investors of what they do, the government pension funds in the various countries. They play a very significant role, and to the degree that they embrace this and provide leadership, you see more movement. If there's less, there's a bit less. So I think that's maybe a common theme. That's from a thematic perspective. I think it was mentioned carbon is one issue that comes up often. Diversity is also an issue that in some markets is very prominent. I mean, looking forward, I mean, we are very optimistic about the opportunities of growth in Asia. I know that on the corporate segment, so when it comes to second-party opinions, it's roughly a quarter of our business, so it's very significant compared to, say, maybe the broader investor-based business. So there's a lot of interest from corporates in this space. As I said, we are optimistic. I think it's maybe the question, well, not whether, but when. So I think it's always the question, when does the market suddenly really turn? I mean, I've been in this industry for some 20 years. I think there were, I noticed in Europe, also North America, some very unexpected developments and suddenly created a tilt or an acceptance of something that before was not accepted. So it's not something one can easily plan, but we see a lot of signals that things are looking very, very positively. Maybe I stop on that note.
No, I will stay with you actually, Hans-Ulrich. I think we heard about the need for data quality, and we hear that a lot in the market. You are at the forefront for the analysis of the data quality that is gathered from issuer, and especially in Asia. And you mentioned that you are active on second opinion. In fact, Sustainalytics even have a 100% market share in some countries in Asia. That is quite striking as a market share. I would like you to elaborate on this. I mean, in Asia, usually, sometimes with corporates, I would say the quality of the ESG data that we were able to gather was, I would say, lagging a bit compared to what we have elsewhere. Do you see that moving fastly enough so that really the asset manager here around the table can develop ESG strategies that are in line with what they are doing elsewhere?
I think the data could be and disclosure could be better. I think that's clear. But I think it's good to say that I think this is maybe a little bit less developed in Asia, but I think I could say a lot of things about disclosure in Europe and North America, where you think, well,
that's the moment you can say many things.
There's a big way to go. I mean, if you start with climate, I think that has been raised here as an issue. If you look at the 10,000 biggest companies, there are 3,000 that report on Scope 1, Scope 2, and the rest, well, we estimate. And I mean, for a theme that's everywhere, it's quite impressive that you're, let's say, only there, and we're not talking about Scope 3 or anything that goes beyond that. But I think Asia is making big steps in becoming more transparent, and so I think that the gaps are clearly closing. We had recently a webinar to introduce to corporates also our new rating, as to explain, well, what has changed and how do we assess companies and how they can engage with us. We had, I think, 800 companies who registered. I mean, unseen generally this level of interest from corporates, and many from Asia. So I think there's a gap, but I think they are closing that gap fast.
And maybe I would like also to, actually, I would like to hear Jonas and Stanislas on this also. I mean, does the quality of the ESG data that you have in Asia have any impact, or does it change the way you do ESG investing in this part of the world?
I don't know whether there is a nation issue. You have different kind of asset classes. You have different, of course, on the emerging market, we have to do more, and it's and data is a question. So, but I'm very positively impressed by the dynamics of the market of data providers. So we have big guys, we know them well, Sustainalytics. I won't mention some others. And you have very newcomers. Some of them, well, of doubtful quality, low track record, very new, but remain to be followed and checked regularly. And some others very interesting already, using most of them artificial intelligence, machine learning, all that, using diffuse data. It's very interesting. Even, I'm sure Sustainalytics does it, but even very traditional extra-financial rating agencies, of course, use these new means. They can give you more interesting data, more complete overview on issuers, and also new kind maybe of connections between data. So you can document, for instance, what's going on, the resilience, the consistency of a strategy, business model, services and products. All these are key issues if you want to assess an issuer, and also maybe to document more and more on impact, because this is a big issue. We all know that. It's very complicated to be square on the causality chain and the additionality, intentionality, and all these data and connections between data, more and more allowed by new intelligence, artificial intelligence means, might help a lot asset managers and asset owners. But so I'm not sure. Again, there is an issue in Asia. There is obviously an issue emerging on small mid caps, for instance. That's for sure. But I'm pretty confident that we might fill the gap in the coming months and years.
Yeah, and just adding basically that, and maybe we speak about China, for example, right, where we now see and this is the equity market, of course, where the indices open up, right? I think foreign ownership of Chinese equity is still around 2%. It's normally the number you hear, but it's opening up now, and it's getting included in the major indices as well. And immediately, certain other competitors are very quick there. I think there are about like 400 constituents that have been rated now, and that's just within a year, right? So there are significant resources put from a lot of service providers in order to get rating information down there. There is gap, but it's closing much faster than anywhere else, right? I think in Europe, when I start looking into these questions, you had certain people that tried to be very ambitious about it and very outspoken about it, almost like part of the marketing. And then 10 years later, it has slowly started changing a little bit. In Asia, everything goes much quicker, and the force is there for the moment, absolutely.
Thank you. There was another topic that you raised, Jonas, which was the role of policymakers, but that will lead me to a question to Courtney, actually. You say that, I mean, we've seen in Europe, I mean, this, ESG market has grown basically bottom up. I mean, with development from asset manager first, and now we see the European Commission thinking about developing a taxonomy and trying to regulate, quote unquote, regulate this market a little bit. The dynamic is a bit different in Asia. I mean, probably, I mean, if you look at China, the green bond market has been driven by the government. What do you see as a role for the regulation the regulators in Asia to assist for the development of ESG in the different regions in Asia? That's a question for you, Courtney, actually. I mean, the specialized bank for this topic in Asia, clearly, and beyond. I mean, what do you expect, or would you welcome as a role for regulators in Asia to spur the development of this ESG investing market? Should they stay quiet and let the market develop themselves? Should they let the EIB push for the development of it, or should they nudge it somehow?
No, it's a good question, and it's something that has been happening for a long time on the green credit side. So, China, I think in 2007 or 2008, put forward the green credit policy. And that was really a changing point for loans, for lending in China. Now I think we're seeing, you're right, in Asia, things are much more top down. They're not, it's not as bottom up like it is in Europe and in North America. And, but it differs, it depends on the country. If you look at the green credit policy development, you'll see some countries where it was led by the banking associations. You'll see other countries where it was led by the regulators. And I think both approaches are welcome. And it's going to be country specific in most cases.
No, maybe, Tanguy, I would disagree slightly bit with what you said. Being French, and Amundi being a French actor, I must say that regulatory authorities and political authorities have been quite bold in France. So it's true, it's been bottom up. It's true, Amundi has been key in developing the SRI market in France and Europe. But when you think about this 2015 law on climate change and energy transition and green economy, and this very famous Article 173. Well, today it means that banks and asset managers have to monitor the matching of their portfolios with the 2 degrees trajectory. This is quite challenging. So it's nice in a way because it creates a competitive edge for French actors. We have to abide by the rules anyway. But I must say that we've been pushed also by the regulatory authorities.
Can I add a perspective, in fact, with respect to China? When I look at the green bond market, for example, in fact, in a market which is still very much controlled in China and where the regulator obviously plays a key role. But what I see, in fact, at the same time, in Eurobond, in the international market, we have the market standards, basically, ICMA, the green bond principles, and what have you. But when you see the interaction between Chinese authorities and the market-driven guidances which we have, it's enormous. And in fact, and when you see the how close, in fact, we are moving, and we are just waiting for probably like everybody else for an update of the green bond catalog coming out of the PBOC, which probably, in fact, will us bring much closer to where we are in the international side. And when I'm looking in Europe with the EU action plan on one hand, I think, in fact, I read a lot of inspiration from the market side in what they are doing. And that's exactly, in fact, what we need, an interaction between market and regulators, because at the end of the day, what you need is practical solutions, practical guidelines, which are implementable in capital markets. And that's where you need both to interact very tightly.
Yes, Anne-Sophie?
One thing to add, when you're thinking about policy making and green finance, I think there's a lot of focus on, I'd say, the supply side. How can we make sure that capital flows to green or sustainable activities? And I think it has an important role to play, and I'd say it supports the market. I don't think one should forget the demand side. So I think the broader market environment that governments set in which companies operate, and as long as certain things that you want to finance are not, there's no business case, well, water will not flow uphill. So I think it is something where, let's say, creating markets and creating a business environment that steers company in a certain direction is, from my perspective, more important than the other side.
That's a fair point. But Robert, on that front, I mean, you're well positioned to see how the demand from investors is growing to get those ESG data. I mean, they will probably ask you if it's available on the stock exchange. I mean, do you see that coming also increasingly from Asia, this demand from investors?
Well, in fact, what's interesting, in fact, we are working quite a lot with China, in fact, and why I'm saying China all the time, not Asia, in fact, because basically China is the biggest green bond market around. Many other countries are just discovering, in fact, that market, and we have seen, in fact, demand driven for Chinese domestic products to understand how Chinese green bonds functions and what are the differences and what have you. So we are displaying, for example, a lot of data from Chinese domestic markets translated into English on our platform. And that is, well, and by doing so, in fact, we are, what we see, encouraging international investors also looking at the Chinese domestic market. It had a side effect which is extremely welcome. It exposed, in fact, Chinese domestic companies under their domestic standards to the international investor scrutiny, if I may call it that way. And when you are looking at, you find today a number of Chinese issuers who are still using the domestic market, but which are also issuing in the international market. And by doing so, in fact, you suddenly realize that you need to comply with two sets of rules, and above all, that it's not impossible at all of applying international standards. And that's the way, in fact, where we are bridging the gap between these very important markets.
True. Thank you very much. Maybe the last question for Mr. Flint. So you have announced, I think yesterday or today, this transaction that you're doing with the AIB, where you will have to manage funds with some ESG component, a large ESG component. Does it mean that in the near future there will be more ESG analysts at Aberdeen in Asia than in Europe?
I wouldn't like to say that. Oops, I need to focus. I wouldn't like to say there'll be more in Asia, but there'll be more everywhere. And I think the most exciting part of the mandate is that it's not on a kind of a scoring basis. It's holistic, and I think you talked about ESG ratings and so on, and these are going to have a role to play. But I think it's really important that we don't get in exclusively to a sort of a metrics-driven world, because that will just lead to consulting services telling you how to improve the score as opposed to improve the outcome. And I think the holistic approach that the AIB is requiring to have a dialogue, to have engagement, and it requires, yes, there will be more ESG analysts. And indeed, I think ESG is one of these things that in 5 years' time we shouldn't be talking about, because there won't be any other way of doing it. It's an extraordinary label for doing the right thing. So we will have more analysts everywhere.
Thank you. This will be the last word. Thank you very much for the panel. Join me in thanking them and applauding them. Thank you very much.